Next up is how to draw isometric circles. Now you'll notice that I have a few steps, same as before, box method, but the box itself should be something that allows for us to think of the circle or cylinder as being squared off as opposed to round. So the box's width and depth, or depth and height, or height and width should all be the same as the circle or cylinder's diameter. We need to identify the tangent points on the legs of the square or rectangle that we use for the box. We need to connect the corners together so that we can create this X through the square. And we need to identify the 2/3 marks so that we can figure out where the curve for the different parts of the ellipse or circle that's isometric will move through those diagonal lines from corner to corner. And then we need to lightly sketch the arcs themselves. We'll start by doing this with congruent arcs, arcs that are the same on either side of the entire ellipse, and then we'll delineate the final thing. A couple of points. Always draw arcs or curves. The best way to do that is to take your fingers, and whereas before with straight lines we were moving the entire arm at the elbow or the shoulder, now we're going to start using the fingers, rotating them back and forth to make more of an arc shape, or you can even bend the wrist if that's better. Don't draw any flat or straight lines. This goes right along with the first point. Bend your wrist or move your fingers, and you're going to make more like an ellipse than a circle. After all, these are isometric circles, but they are basically an ellipse. All right, now you can see how I've already gone through and made a 3x3, a 2x2, and a 1x1, and as they get smaller, the diameter that is, the isometric circles get a little harder to make. And you'll see I had a couple of issues, especially here on the top one. This side does not quite look the same as this one, and those congruent sides should look fairly the same. All of them are relatively well done, but there are some minor mistakes with them. And this can all be finished up in the final steps when you delineate and you make your final marks. Smaller they get, harder they are to make. There's less room for that error to be corrected. Today, though, we're going to work with this 4x4 square on the top, on the front, and on the side. Not very difficult to do, but it does take some practice. Now, step one was to make the box, and for that box to be what the cylinder would create. You'll find that I'm not going to draw the actual cylinder here, but later in some of this leftover space that I have, I'm going to draw one of the activities, more cylindrical shaped objects for activity 2.1. Now, my next step is to identify the tangent points, which I've already done as well. For the top face, this is a tangent point, tangent point, tangent point, and another tangent point. These are always the midpoints of the 4 different legs of the square. Third step is for me to connect the corners together with a nice lightly drawn construction line. So I'll connect together the 2 vertical corners, and this time I'm going to draw a horizontal line, which I very rarely do in an isometric, to connect the 2 corners together on the horizontal plane. My fourth step is that I come in and identify the 2/3 mark. Now, the 2/3 mark is a little trickier to pick up on. I used the 4x4 for a purpose. If this is the direct center of my circle, then I find that from corner to corner horizontally, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 spots of interest moving from the center. A total of 8, but 4 on either side of the center. There's also one vertical line, an intersection of isometric lines, and another vertical line. They're evenly spaced out, so I can think of them as a fourth, a half, 3/4, and a whole. So if I want 2/3, that's somewhere in between a half and 3/4. Now, 2/3 being 0.6 repeating is closer to 0.75, which is 3/4. So I'm going to estimate and say it's going to be somewhere right around here. More than 0.5 and closer to the 0.75. I'm going to make a gentle little arc through there, nothing real permanent. I'll do the same thing on the other side. There's the half, here's the 3/4, so somewhere right in here. Going from the center down or forward, I will find that 1, 2 is all I really have as far as points of interest, anywhere that things intersect or are identifiable. But I can think about the fact that since this is a half and a whole, then halfway in between those is where I could find a quarter, a half, 3/4. So again, if I'm looking for 2/3, it's going to be somewhere right in here, right before that 3/4 mark. Same thing on this side, quarter, half, 3/4. So I want my mark to be right about there. All right, now I've done steps 1 through 4 pretty quick. Now I'd already set up steps 1 and 2. 3 was fairly easy to do, and 4, after a little bit of explanation and some practice and knowing to be consistent, it's pretty easy to do as well. Step 5 would be to lightly sketch the congruent arcs. Now, I have a tendency to start with one side and then move to the congruent side as well. It doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent with this. I do also start with the midpoints, those tangent spots, those tangent marks, and I try to make an arc so that it curves away from the tangent. Now, this is tricky, and most people have a tendency to create more of a straight line. Just remember that this line should always be arcing away, never really being straight. And remember that it's relatively lightly drawn so that I can erase it at a later time. I'll rotate the paper upside down, and I'll do the same thing on this side, going through the 3/4 mark. Excuse me, the 2/3 mark. Very close to the 3/4 mark. Again, this is a very sketchy line. I'm not trying to be super cautious with it, other than to make sure that I don't make straight lines or any real flat spots, and try to only touch tangent at the tangent points. Now that I have those two lines created, those two arcs, I'm going to make the other two congruent sides. This is a bigger arc this time. Before, the arc had a much tighter radius. Now the radius is much greater. Make the same mark from this end. Try to position my paper so that it's more natural for my arm, my wrist, my fingers to move in this arc-like fashion. And then once I'm fairly confident that I can call this a circle or an isometric circle, that it looks more like an ellipse, then I'm going to have a tendency to want to delineate this. This is where it gets trickier. This is where I want to be very certain that I'm not going back and forth, but rather always going forward, always trying to hit the best spot possible. If you're good at it, you can do it without making sketch movements rather just make one constant arc. But it does get difficult with those bigger radii. All right, I'm fairly confident that I like that. And yeah, it looks pretty good. Not my best one, but still rather good. I'll repeat this, but much quicker this time for the front and the right. Now to delineate it, with practice, you can see that this is fairly easy to make. In the next video, I'll work on making the isometric circles for the cylindrical shape that you'll see in activity 2.1, number 7. And we'll work on this object. I'll make that in this space here. And for the whole, I'll show you how to do isometric circle tonal shading.